back in the morning with James Max and Julia Hartley-Brewer. Let us talk now to Richard Taylor, though, political commentator. There's much to discuss, not least kicking off with what went on over the weekend. Richard, a very good afternoon to you. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Mike. It's good to be on the home of common sense.
It is nice, isn't it? Thank God.
Because there's not much common sense in the House of Commons at the moment, is it? Let's be honest.
Well, there isn't, and there's not much in your sort of home country of Wales either. What's going on with old Drakeford these days?
Well, I think your viewers will know my thoughts on Mark Drakeford, but certainly, what we saw over the weekend, Mike, was extraordinary to see tens of thousands of people across the UK campaigning against these vaccine mandates, because quite clearly the government have got this completely wrong. From the experts, from Dr. Steve James you've had on, to the NHS 100, their campaign Together declaration with over 160,000 signatures that were delivered to 10 Downing Street earlier last week. A petition that's nearly hit 250,000 people online for the UK government to do a U-turn on this. Clearly, there is huge public pressure on the government right now. And as you rightly pointed out, this is possibly just a nudge to try and get people, coerce people into getting vaccinated. And it goes against their body autonomy, their freedom of choice, and all the things that in a Western democracy, Mike, we hold dear. And the issue really, Mike, is not so much just this. If this goes through and it's made mandatory, what else can this government do at a stroke of a pen? That's what worries me and a lot of people, I'm sure.
And I wonder whether they were shocked at the weekend by the sheer numbers of people, not only on the demonstrations, but the sheer numbers of people who were from the NHS, because it was quite a picture, wasn't it, when you saw all those uniforms being laid down in Trafalgar Square and laid down outside of Downing Street. And so you suddenly got the idea that, and I'm not suggesting for a minute that the other people on those marches who don't work for the NHS are there for nefarious reasons, but I think the government likes to think of those people as kind of anti-vaxxers, nutty people who are extremists. But these are not. These are people at the NHS frontline who are not going to take it anymore, who have said enough is enough, we're not doing it.
Yeah, they've worked for the last 22 months, Mike. Remember this, even before the vaccine was brought in, risking their lives according to the government. And yet, they built up, many of them, they caught COVID more than twice. They built up natural immunity, which they say is just as good, if not better, than the vaccine itself. And yet to see the demonstration from those frontline workers on the weekend with their uniforms was very, very powerful and very moving for a lot of people. I'm sure politicians were paying attention to that. And I think the government now needs to drop immediately this idea of pushing it and, we're going to delay it. It needs to change. And Dean Zahawi this morning on Julie's programme stated that he has a duty of care to patients. But I would remind him he has a duty of care to the staff that work on the NHS. And let's not forget all the care workers that have already lost their jobs, Mike. And we've got a crisis in the NHS. We've been told by 2025, 12 million people will be on the waiting list. And so we want to go from clapping those wonderful NHS workers now to sacking them potentially 80,000 to 100. We don't really know the figures. And it's really sad in a Western democracy, as I've already pointed out, where people's bodily choice, autonomy, what they do with their bodies, is being legislated for by government in such a way that if they don't have it, they lose their jobs. I mean, this is not the Britain that I wanted to grow up in. You're in Wales, of course, different. Mark Drakeford is welcoming unjabbed nurses and doctors to come and work down here if they lose their jobs in England.
I mean, that rather confused me, I must admit, because, I mean, I don't see Drakeford, normally speaking, as somebody less draconian than the Westminster government, but in this particular instance, it seems to be the case.
Well, I'm going to say something on record, which I'll probably get recorded and put on Twitter, I'm sure. But yeah, I actually support Mark Drakeford on this issue. But I will say there is a reason for this year, because our NHS in Wales has been in crisis for decades. So it's not like before the pandemic. And any action that Mark Drakeford would take to sack NHS workers for not being vaccinated would absolutely decimate the NHS. So there's ulterior motives there. And there's a political reasons. He doesn't get on with Boris, the Conservative government. A lot of political stuff has been played here. But look, the key thing is important for the pressure to continue from groups such as NHS 100, Together Declaration, and shows like yourself. And thankful, we have these platforms now where, and it's interesting, Mike, isn't it, that the mainstream media that were very afraid of covering some of these protests because of the narrative when against what they were putting out there, all of a sudden the mask is slipping, excuse the pun, and people are waking up and realising, hang on a minute, the numbers that were reported from COVID with COVID weren't true. So 17,000 people have died. Nadeem Zahawi quoted 90% of people are in ICU, they're unvaccinated. Wrong. Fact check, in December it was 61%.
But they've done something which is quite clever, which, as I'm sure you know, Richard, they do all the time, where they've reinvented the word. Unvaccinated now doesn't mean you haven't had a vaccine; it just means you haven't had 3. And suddenly the numbers go raging through the roof. And Boris was careful to check himself, I saw the other day, because he said, a great majority of people haven't been boosted. which is another way of saying they've had 2, they haven't had 3. And you go, well, hang on a minute, what are they doing in hospital if they've had 2 vaccinations? How does that work? And why don't you actually tell us what sort of condition they're in, what sort of age they are, and the real reason why we should or should not be frightened?
Yeah, I think going back not being frightened, let's remember the parties are allegedly taking place at 10 Downing Street. If the virus was so deadly, then why weren't those at the party either hospitalised or dead? And we know, Mike, the vaccine doesn't stop the transmission.
Right.
We know that whether you're double vaccinated, boosted, and you qualify as being vaccinated. Because what does being vaccinated mean, as you rightly point out? And it doesn't stop the transmission. So ultimately, we have a situation where, and we've seen it as well, where the unvaccinated workers for the last how many months have been covering shifts for those who've been vaccinated. Because they're off with COVID.
Right.
I mean, the whole thing just smacks in the face of ridiculous. And that's what it is. And I think the government now need to drop this idea of mandates because it doesn't wash. I don't know what they'll gain politically from doing it. I don't understand why they think they're going to gain anything from doing this. And we've seen the rebellion in the Conservative Party, Mike, on a whole range of issues you've covered this morning with Peter Hitchens, many other guests as well. This is one of those things I think is not going to go in. The government needs to make an announcement very soon and drop this. We have the Coronavirus Act lapsing at the end of March in the UK. And of course, Boris has indicated he's not going to renew that. But here in Wales, Mark Drakeford said under devolved powers, he still has the power to maintain some of those emergency powers here in Wales as well, which is quite frightening under the Public Health Act 1984, because our NHS in Wales has been in crisis for decades. So it's not like before the pandemic. And any action that Mark Drakeford would take to sack NHS workers for not being vaccinated would absolutely decimate the NHS. So there's ulterior motives there. And there's a political reasons. He doesn't get on with Boris, you know, the Conservative government. A lot of political stuff has been played here. But look, the key thing is important for the pressure to continue from groups such as NHS 100, Together Declaration, and shows like yourself. And thankful, you know, we have these platforms now where, and it's interesting, Mike, isn't it, that the mainstream media that were very afraid of covering some of these protests because of the narrative when against what they were putting out there, all of a sudden the mask is slipping, excuse the pun, and people are waking up and realising, hang on a minute, the numbers that were reported from COVID with COVID weren't true. It's 17,000 people have died. Nadeem Zahawi quoted 90% of people are in ICU, they're unvaccinated. Wrong. Fact check, in December it was 61%. You know,
but they've done something which is quite clever, which, as I'm sure you know, Richard, they do all the time, where they've reinvented the word. You know, unvaccinated now doesn't mean you haven't had a vaccine; it just means you haven't had 3. You know, and suddenly the numbers go raging through the roof. And Boris was careful to check himself, I saw the other day, because he said, you know, a great majority of people haven't been boosted. Which is another way of saying they've had 2, they haven't had 3. And you go, well, hang on a minute, what are they doing in hospital if they've had 2 vaccinations? How does that work? And why don't you actually tell us what sort of condition they're in, what sort of age they are, and the real reason why we should or should not be frightened?
Yeah, I think going back not being frightened, let's remember the parties are allegedly taking place at 10 Downing Street. If the virus was so deadly, then why weren't those at the party either hospitalised or dead? And we know, Mike, the vaccine doesn't stop the transmission. We know that whether you're double vaccinated, boosted, and you qualify as being vaccinated. Because what does being vaccinated mean, as you rightly point out? And it doesn't stop the transmission. So ultimately, we have a situation where, and we've seen it as well, where the unvaccinated workers for the last how many months have been covering shifts for those who've been vaccinated. Because they're off with COVID. I mean, the whole thing just smacks in the face of ridiculous. And that's what it is. And I think the government now need to drop this idea of mandates because it doesn't wash. I don't know what they'll gain politically from doing it. I don't understand why they think they're going to gain anything from doing this. And we've seen the rebellion in the Conservative Party, Mike, on a whole range of issues you've covered this morning with Peter Hitchens, many other guests as well. This is one of those things I think is not going to go in. The government needs to make an announcement very soon and drop this. We have the Coronavirus Act lapsing at the end of March in the UK. And of course, Boris has indicated he's not going to renew that. But here in Wales, Mark Drakeford said under devolved powers, he still has the power to maintain some of those emergency powers here in Wales as well, which is quite frightening under the Public Health Act 1984. And of course, what we have here in Wales, we still have vaccine passports. I can't let the show go by without mentioning Mark Drakeford, the Emperor on the Cardiff Bay.
Because, of course, we don't have them any longer. We've been told that they're of no use. We know they're of no use. They don't make any difference whatsoever to your life. They don't make any difference to the safety of an event. Absolute waste of time.
Yeah. Well, I think Mark Drakeford's following science fiction and not science because quite clearly they don't work. I mean, we've seen that. In November, he shut the nightclubs down.
The day of the Gliffords.
They brought in vaccine passports in November and they said, we're bringing them in so we can keep places like nightclubs open. By December, he shut all the nightclubs. So clearly they don't work.
So what does it mean for the Six Nations? What's he doing about that?
Well, interestingly enough, now, of course, being the First Minister of Wales, he's going to get free tickets. And of course,
I remember the good old days. I used to get free tickets to the Six Nations.
I'm sure I can get some from my local rugby club for you, Mike, and send them to you. But yeah, look, the changes in the law here, fans couldn't go and watch rugby up until a few weeks ago, if you remember, Drakeford's new rules. He's changed those rules ahead of the Six Nations, of course, and I seen some Labour politicians last week taking photos of themselves at a rugby stadium down in my hometown of Llanelli, the Scarlets there. Yeah, so, you know, any opportunity they get for freebies, Mike, then I'm sure they'll change the legislation. So I'd say to all the rugby clubs out there, throw as many tickets to Drakeford as you can.
Well, yeah, because I mean, one of the things I saw maybe a week or two ago was that some suggestions from the Welsh Rugby Union, they might actually play their home games in England because that way they'd actually make some money. They'd be able to sell tickets.
I mean, it's absolutely crazy.
It's mad, isn't it?
I mean, it's crazy. So the economy here in Wales has been suffering anyway under devolution, in my opinion. And to think that Mark Drakeford has made these rules, pushing, you know, businesses to England. And New Year's Eve was a perfect example, Mike. The amount of people that left Wales to party in England because nightclubs were shut. You couldn't go anywhere. The table of six, you know, the mask wearing is still in place. All the kind of things that Drakeford loves to have. And, you know, for me, it's no surprise for you to hear this and your viewers as well and your listeners, Mike. I'm no big fan of Mark Drakeford. I think what he's done to Wales has been absolutely terrible. I think that, you know, yes, and people forget as well, you know, Wales still has the highest levels of death according to the figures in the whole of the UK, and people forget that, and yet he calls himself a man with safe hands and a grandfather figure to the rest of Wales. But unfortunately, I think until a public inquiry is held into the handling of what has taken place with the Welsh Government, which, by the way, they're deflecting. They don't want an independent public inquiry. They want to be part of a UK inquiry.
I was going to ask you that. Was going to be my next question. Are they having an independent inquiry just for Wales? Because they kind of need one, don't they?
Well, certainly not. I mean, there are a number of opposition parties here in Wales, in the Senate, the Welsh Parliament, that is, for your viewers and listeners, Mike, that are calling for that. And there is a huge movement of people here gathering across social media as well, saying, look, there needs to be a public inquiry because people lost loved ones during this pandemic as a result of some of the lockdown measures and restrictions. And people talk about Boris, you know, some of the things he's done whilst people couldn't visit their loved ones dying. We had the same here in Wales under a different government. I mean, spare a thought for us, Mike. We have to live under two pathetic governments. That's just my opinion, right? The Welsh government and the UK government. But certainly I think there needs to be an independent public inquiry into the handling, and especially some of the rules, Mike. We had, you know, certain aisles in shops taped up. I mean, you couldn't
Well,
get
I remember
your breath.
that when they were taping up sort of, you know, magazine racks and bookshelves and I think even clothing for children because that wasn't considered to be essential. I mean, we've all been through this kind of madness. I didn't get a chance to mention it to Rod Little, but I remember back in the beginning of the first lockdown, before people said masks should be worn in supermarkets, I remember going to the supermarket once with gloves on because somebody had said you should wear gloves. I had these latex gloves, which I had from the office, right? These green. I looked like some kind of madman. I'm walking around with gloves on in the supermarket. People are going, all right, okay then. And I only did it once because there was no point to it. You know, I used to put a glove on to fill the car with petrol. You know, all that kind of stuff. And you kind of go, what did we do all that for? I mean,
I know it was crazy. I could just imagine seeing you walking down an aisle in one of the superstores with rubber gloves on. I tell you what, I'd move really quickly away from you, Mike.
You would.
Imagine you got your shopping done
people
really
usually
quickly.
do, to be fair. But I mean, the other thing, of course, was standing behind somebody, and I don't wish to be in any way critical of older people because I probably could be considered one of them, but standing around with the cheese going, would you just pick some cheese, man? I mean, you're standing there now, 10 minutes I'm waiting to get in. I don't want to get too close to you. But, you know, what cheese are you going to buy any? Are you just going to look at it? What are you doing?
I think as well, Mike, to go back to this, you know, the people who are responsible for some of this fear, because people were scared. You know, you said you wore gloves and people were scared at the start. We all got it, but then we all started to see through the cracks. And I think the people responsible, yes, the mainstream media, but journalists, political commentators and others as well, who really pushed this narrative. And we're seeing them now I've never seen so much backpedaling in all my life.
I know.
I mean,
they've all suddenly discovered that what we were saying about a year and a half ago is actually true.
Piers Morgan is calling out the Prime Minister of New Zealand now on lockdowns. I mean, you can't get your breath. You know, Jeremy Vine, for example. There's so many of them that are backpedal. We're just waiting for James Whale to do a bit of backpedaling as well.
Well, that's
Mike.
always possible. You know, I'm working on Whale behind the scenes. You know, I'm working his gears to see whether or not we can get him to change his mind, because he changed his mind on Brexit. You know, this is a guy who was all about remaining until he worked out that was wrong. So listen, but these are all estimable characters that you've mentioned. They're all people that I know. They're all people whose work I respect greatly, and I will give them all a hard time the first chance I get. But tell me this: what happens to those people who have been who found themselves out of a job in the care homes? Because presumably if the government sort of U-turns on this NHS vaccine mandate, they don't owe these other people anything, even though they should get their jobs back. Because I remember there was a court case, wasn't there, saying, this is unfair dismissal, which wasn't successful. So I'm not sure those people have got anywhere to go, have they?
Well, I think this is going to be the challenge for the government, because should they do away with, and they should, mandatory vaccines, then of course they're going to have to reconsider. And the care workers that have been sacked as well, surely there's cause for them and there's reprisals and consequences for their employers as well, because surely they should be reinstated fully as well, because you can't have it for one without the other. And I think pushing this and delaying this date is not really the answer. And we know why they're doing it, Mike. They're doing it to encourage more people to take their boosters so they're vaccinated, and no doubt the booster after that and after that and after that. But look, they need to be reinstated, in my opinion. I think what has happened has been tragic when you consider the actual current crisis in the NHS with A&E, ambulance times and all that kind of stuff. I had the same situation. My wife, she had a suspected heart attack last year, and we were told we had to wait 4 hours for an ambulance or phone a taxi. That were the options. I mean, and that's, what we've been facing. And I feel sad for those who have fought on the NHS. And many of them have been working for decades. I spoke to a nurse yesterday, been working for 22 years in the NHS. And because she's chosen not to have medical because she considers herself to be healthy and fit and doesn't need it. And she said to me, look, if the people in hospital, patients I treat, have been vaccinated and they're told that vaccination protects them, the only person that's unprotected according to that logic is me. And if I choose to do that, that's my choice.
Sure.
And a lot of people listening to the show today, Mike, and watching will understand that. They can see, yes, it is their choice. And the government need to drop this immediately, not only from the public pressure, but from an employment point of view and the crisis in the NHS, Mike. It all seems to make sense to me to end this madness. And let's get back to the old normal, Mike. Do you remember what that looked like?
Do you know, I don't. I'm looking for somebody to tell me, but I'm hopeful that when it does happen, you'll get out of Wales, we'll have a drink, and all will be well. Richard, thank you very much indeed. Richard Taylor there with a roundup of why the government needs to do this U-turn on NHS vaccine mandates, because it doesn't make any sense. And I've got this from Angela, who says this will be a huge people power triumph, overturning the vaccine mandate for NHS and carers. However, still lots of companies